All right, we are back talking about season 4 in Chosen Conversations with the Chosen. So we're really excited to talk about different themes that we've seen throughout this season. One of the themes we're going to talk about specifically today is the opposition toward Jesus. He faces, during his ministry and during his life, he faces a lot of different instances from a lot of different input for him and his followers with opposition. A couple episodes in to season 4 really focuses on death, and then moving into the father of Rama, who is accepting the body back. So I'll kind of pass that over to Stan and let you kind of talk a little bit about your thoughts about Kaphne and the impact of that on the opposition of Jesus.
Yeah, thanks, Rachel. I was thinking while you were saying that, episode 3 of season 4 is where Rama gets stabbed and passes away, and all the questioning happens. And then they are taking Rama's body back to her homeland. All the disciples and Jesus walking along behind the wagon that's carrying her casket, and they encounter Kaphne, her dad, on the road. And this has sort of been building for a while because Kaphne was not in agreement. We talked in a previous episode about how they'd asked Jesus to give Rama away because Kaphne was not in support of their marriage, her and Thomas. But when they meet Kaphne on the road, it's totally different. Anger has exponentially gone up because Kaphne says some things when he encounters them, does not let them proceed on with Rama's body. They're unwelcome to actually mourn with him, which is interesting by itself. And then when Jesus says, we're just trying to mourn with you, Thomas defends the fact that Rama loved Jesus and that this was not anything because of Jesus that this happened. Kaphne responds with some very targeted words towards Jesus, calls him a devil, calls him a sorcerer, and says that he will do whatever he needs to do to expose Jesus. And then finally at the end, which Simon Z has to step up and kind of play his role, Kaphne says to Jesus, the next time you see me, I will be the last thing you see. And so I think this is foreshadowing to later in the series, what we'll see that Kaphne is going to be some sort of rabble rouser or ringleader of the opposition to Jesus.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. We'll see it develop in season 5 ultimately, and then in season 6. But it's part of the story making here to represent that there are people in the life of Jesus who are not just enthused with Jesus. They don't like Jesus. Jesus is not being received by everyone. So I think he represents that element of the story that even among the common folk, not just the leaders, there are people who don't get it. And they find this dangerous and they find this risky. And for Kaphne, it risked his own daughter. Right? And so that sort of opposition to Jesus is, I think, a helpful thing to put into the story, even though it's not in the biblical text. It's not part of the story in the Gospels, the 4 Gospels, but it is a storyline that I think is really important and prepares us for the rejection of Jesus in season 5 or season 6.
I also heard while you were saying that, the counting of the cost of following Jesus. It wasn't that following Jesus killed Rama, but following Jesus led to the scenarios that came about with that conclusion. Does that make sense, Natalie?
Yeah, that was resonating with me too, just to think about how we might run into things like that in our own life, where a family member might disagree with a choice that we've made because we feel that we've been called to that, or might want to support us but feel like it's a dangerous choice to go into this mission field or into that career or whatever. And so it's interesting to think about that I tend to think about the opposition from the religious leaders, from the government, but to think, we also face, or Jesus also faces, and his followers also face opposition because of our personal choices that it requires of us, right? I mean, because that was exactly what Kaphne was worried about with Rama to begin with, is that she's taken a very unorthodox, difficult path. She's, wandering around in the desert or whatever she's doing. And that had to be a lot of why he had concerns to begin with. And so for that fear to be
Yeah.
realized, you could understand as a human, just as a person, you could understand why he would be so angry and so offended and have such a vendetta against Jesus.
Yeah, I think it's very important, I think, to remember that Jesus said, I came, and the response to my coming is families are going to be divided.
Mhm.
That it's not all going to be peaceful, right?
Mhm.
And that she takes up this choice to be a disciple of Jesus and follow him. That's not a normal thing. I mean, that's weird for women to be a part of a discipleship group like that. And so there's a lot of tension within the family. And I think that's just a helpful thing to remember as Christ followers. If we're going to follow Jesus, yeah, we're going to have that tension in the family sometimes, that it's not all going to be nice and rosy and peaceful. The people are going to question our choices if we're actually following Jesus.
Absolutely. And you make me think about the tension in one of the other families, if you will, in the series, and that's the Sanhedrin. And Rachel, we see a bunch of disagreement and anger and concern and ego being protected because of what Jesus is saying and doing. And I think it carries over from Caphne has a father to daughter type situation, but the religious leaders seem to have a tradition to blasphemy or opposition to tradition that is very similar in some ways, because the anger comes out the same as Caphne's did. Caphne has that threatening statement, almost like I will try to kill you. He didn't say that, but when he says the last time when you see me next will be the last thing you see. Well, the Sanhedrin are now contemplating getting rid of Jesus, right?
Yeah, I think each scene, every time we get to see into the discussions within the Sanhedrin and maybe even Caiaphas and his speeches and different people within the Sanhedrin, um I guess I don't culturally understand that very well, so I see a lot of, those leaders feeling a lot of responsibility toward leading the people that they're supposed to be leading, and trying to figure out who is this person, and he seems like a threat to us. But then there's a few of them who are questioning that and wondering whether or not he really is a threat or whether or not he's just another person that, another teacher that we need to talk through. So listening to those conversations overall, John Mark, you talked about this tension that keeps rising up. I feel like we see that within the Sanhedrin as well. And this responsibility to lead them and keep tradition and keep the law of Moses and make sure we don't lose the commitment to that. And here's a man who is threatening that very thing that they believe so strongly. And I find that the tension is palpable in each one of those meetings. It's very fiery, it's very intense, lots of disagreements about even if they disagree that Jesus is a threat, how is he a threat? And what are we going to do with that? And how are we going to address them? And what are we looking for? And so I see that coming to a boil within those meetings.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. As the Sanhedrin is meeting together, there's kind of two things that they're concerned about. One is the tradition, the law, and being faithful to the law and being the guardians of the law and the guardians of the people in that regard. But also they're fearful of the Romans, and they're fearful of losing power, and they're fearful of what the Romans might do, because there's a history here that occupiers might destroy the temple or they might desecrate the temple. And so protecting the temple by staying in a healthy, or at least a peaceful, I should say, relationship with the Roman authorities is really important. Trying to navigate that, hanging on to the law, and at the same time navigating your relationship with the Romans to maintain power, and Jesus is a threat to that peace. Jesus
Yes.
represents a disturbance, and so disturbance have to be mollified, right? They have to be put down, and that's kind of the question that's coming up in the Sanhedrin. What are we going to do with this guy, right?
And I noticed that what happens, it seems to happen in several of the episodes, kind of in the middle of season 4, is that we have these scene segments. We go to something like Gaffney on the road, then we come to the Sanhedrin, then we go to something else, and we come back to the Sanhedrin. So there's these parallel storylines going on at the same time. And while John Mark was talking, I was thinking about how ironic it is that they're trying to protect what they would see as the presence of God among them in the temple at the cost of Jesus, who's the presence of God among them. It's just unbelievable. But it flashes to another scene, Natalie, that I was thinking about that's somewhat comical. We know the Sermon on the Mount, and we know information in the Sermon on the Mount, and we can hear and almost see Jesus giving this sermon, right? And saying,
Mhm.
if someone bids you to go 1 mile, go 2. But I'd never thought about him actually doing it. Not that he wouldn't
Mhm.
have, but just what if he was preaching something he had actually done? So in that scene, there's a lot of humor, in a way, with the interaction between the soldiers at the beginning of the scene compared to at the end when Jesus keeps going and they have to ask him to stop. So Natalie, what did you think about that?
I love that you bring that up. That's actually one of my favorite scenes of this season, I think. Like you say, because I don't know that I ever thought of it being more than an expression. Even when someone had explained to me that that was a practice in Rome at the time, that it was, because go the extra mile is now just something we say from that, right? But to think that there was actually a historical practice that that's rooted in. But even with that, I'd never imagined Jesus ever actually doing that himself. And so I really love the way that that's portrayed and seeing Jesus just humbly say, "All right, I'm gonna do it. I'm gonna do it a second time or second mile." And to see um, their reaction and their nervousness about it, it kind of calls to mind the verse about being kind to your enemy and you'll like heap burning coals onto his head by doing that, that you can kind of see them growing uncomfortable and how he's kind of flipped the script on them and the power has shifted a little bit. Um, so I thought that was interesting.
When you think about the Sermon on the Mount, and those sayings in the Sermon on the Mount, they are intended to be transformative. We do this in order to transform the situation. We
Mm,
we don't return evil for evil. We don't
mhm,
slap back when we get slapped. When somebody asks to go a mile, we go 2. Though, and the point of that is to be transformative. We're involving others in a transformative encounter. And that's what's played out here in The Chosen. They show this scene as transforming not only to the
mm,
disciples, because when we
yes.
when we follow that path, we are transformed ourselves. So Simon the Zealot as carrying Roman armor. I mean, that's
Mm,
that's that's not what you would expect. But he's transformed, and Matthew's
mm,
transformed, and Peter's transformed, but the soldiers are transformed too.
Yeah.
So instead of returning evil for evil and say, "No, I'm not going to do that, and you're going to have to force me, and or I'm going to
mhm,
fight you about this." No, just do it, be transformed by it, and it will transform others in the process. And they picture that in The Chosen, which I think is faithful to the intent of the language of the Sermon on the Mount, that it's transformative encounters.
mm,
Yeah, I agree. I liked between y'all's comments, you making me replay the scene in my head. I like how when they try to get Jesus to stop and the soldier yells at him and says, "I said stop." And he turns and he says, "You can't go the other mile." He said, "We can only mandate that you go 1." And Jesus calls him on the law and says, "Yeah, but by our own volition, we can go the second mile,
mm,
right? If anybody asks, you didn't force us. We decided we would do it." And they're just kind of like, "What is going on?" And they probably, I have heard scholars suggest they probably won't ask Jews anymore to carry their stuff because if they get called in for a court martial, if you will, from doing it and have to go do all the paperwork about going the extra mile, it's more trouble than it's worth. So it's almost like it's subversive. It's raising the quality of the people that are normally looked down upon to equal to the people who have that power, and we should be doing that
Yeah,
for.
I think you're definitely right. It is a subversive act. To go the extra mile is a subversive act. I mean, when you have an enemy or you have someone that you're living in tension with, or you're having a struggle with, and you go the extra mile. That is transformative, and it subverts the power in the situation. Now, Rachel, earlier he mentioned in the Sanhedrin. I don't want to cut you off. You want to say something more
Oh, it's
about
okay.
that, but you can go from there to maybe this point. You mentioned earlier about the Sanhedrin that there was some uncertainty among a few, like Joseph and Shmuel, right? So tell us more about that uncertainty. But if you want to comment on the second mile thing first, go ahead for sure.
Sure. What had come in my head, you're talking about transformative and how I was thinking how powerful it is. When you watch people interact with Jesus in general over all of the series that we've watched, how transformative he is for people. And I think this is just another example of, yeah, he can say these things on the Sermon on the Mount and people hear him, and that is in and of itself shocking. But then when you watch him do it, you also see how his own followers are transformed. Even in that 1 mile, 2 miles that they went, you can see the difference in first they're like rolling their eyes and they're irritated, but they're going to do it because Jesus said. And then they start to feel uncomfortable. So they're like, no, Jesus, you shouldn't carry that. Or no, Mary, you shouldn't carry this. And so you see before you in the traveling, the transformation of his own followers. And then with the transformation of the Roman soldiers, even when they're going that second mile, you can see almost each individual one start to make a shift of like, actually, I'll take the helmet now. You don't need to wear that anymore. And so you just watch these, and even if they're subtle, you just watch the transformative power of the presence of Jesus. And that to me, when you were talking about that, that to me is it leaves such an impact on it would have been like to walk with Jesus, and then what we can be to other people as well. And I think just on down the line
Yeah.
that plays a part.
To lead you into the next segment there in terms of the tension within the Sanhedrin
Yeah.
itself.
Yeah.
Maybe we ought to remind ourselves, like with Kaphne, sometimes that encounter isn't transformative, right?
Yes.
Sometimes that encounter deepens the opposition or deepens the anger or deepens the
Yes.
fear. So you want to maintain your
Yeah.
power, so
Yeah, or hardens the
Yeah,
heart, to use an
right.
Old Testament
Hardens the
term.
heart.
Exactly. So when we encounter Jesus, encountering Jesus doesn't mean, it's all,
Right.
okay, now I'm
Right.
transformed. No, sometimes we kind of put our back
Yeah.
up, harden our hearts and say, no, I like what I'm doing. And I like who I am, and I'm not going to change. And sometimes that's
And I
being
think
encountered. And that's what we have with some of the Sanhedrin, right?
Yeah, I think the Sanhedrin is the most organized way of seeing that in very potent ways. So you see people, of the Sanhedrin who are absolutely hard hearts. This is not happening. In fact, I'm willing to go to the nth degree to protect what I believe is the law and the truth. And he's blasphemous, right? And we're gonna catch him in that, and we're gonna send people out to catch him in that. And then you have people more like Joseph that you were talking about, that are are interested, that are questioning, that are wanting to know, um, who is this person, and can I get some more clarity? And I think the interactions that we get to see in the actual meetings with the Sanhedrin, where they're quiet, but they're also questioning, and you can tell that even afterwards with conversations, and then kind of moving us into like where they actually come to him and ask him about that at dinner with Lazarus and his family, where we kind of catch there.
Yeah.
So Stan, what do you think about that part?
Well, I think while you were talking, you've made a nice segue into kind of some other things that are hanging here with this opposition theme, right? One thing we need to remember in these parallel storylines is that Nicodemus is absent, and he was the one who had really figured out, wait a minute, does God really, not have feet, type thing. And so there's Yosef is kind of figuring this out on his own because he doesn't
Mhm.
have someone like Nicodemus there to support his concerns or his discoveries. And then you said something about hardening of heart and how they get determined to do something. And I think the biggest example of that in season 4 is when they call that he's blasphemy because Jesus says, "I and the Father are one," And when he says that, the text tells us this was really interesting in congregational conversations. The text says they picked up stones to stone him.
Yeah.
It doesn't say they threw any, but angry people, there's always that one person that goes ahead and throws the rock. And what they did is they made it hit Big James. And while the chaos is going on in that episode of Big James laying on the table bleeding, Jesus gets the notification that Lazarus has died. And I thought that was genius, because if it had just been everybody sitting around, nobody saying anything, and a letter comes in, Lazarus is dead, then everybody would have known right then.
Yeah.
But instead, they were too preoccupied with Big James getting stoned when they tried to throw rocks at Jesus. So, Natalie, did that hit you the same way?
It makes it make a little more sense why the disciples are so confused about, wait, is Lazarus asleep, or is he dead, or what has happened? They're already in a place of being very confused. And then for Jesus to say, okay, well, now we're going to go to Bethany, even though they did not before when he was sick, it makes even less sense for him to make that choice when they've just experienced this stoning and James has been hit, right? Which brings up the things we were talking about with Rhema too, right? Like the cost is becoming real. The danger is becoming very real to the disciples. They're starting to see what they're really up against. And I think there's a lot of confusion there. Judas is wanting an uprising to happen. Some of the others are just like, why are we allowing this? Maybe we should be quiet for a while. So there's just a lot of confusion about how to even approach that opposition. Do you back down? Do you rise up? What do you do?
Well, that's a really good point, Natalie. I appreciate that one. So we see some of the inner dynamic of the disciples. Oh, this is getting serious. We could get killed doing this. It's not just Rhema was an accident or something, but hey, we're in danger. And he wants to go back to Jerusalem, and this is what happened the last time we were there. So yeah, we get that sense of the disciples, that kind of fear coming up. Let me shift us to Shmuel, because we have people who are adamantly opposed, like Kaphne, and then we have people who are transformed, like the soldiers are to some extent, and the disciples are transformed as well. Particularly Mary and some of the disciples. But then we have this person in between. Joseph seems to be on his way to faith, right?
Yeah.
But we have this person in between, Shmuel, and he's evaluating, and he's thinking, and he's wondering. He's prayed with Jesus up in Galilee.
Yeah.
So he has this relationship with Jesus. He's not convinced by the main leaders in the Sanhedrin, and yet he's not like Joseph, kind of all on board. He wants to give Jesus a shot. So those are the sort of people that are a part of our lives too. They want to hear that story about Jesus, but they're not quite sure they want to buy into it, and what they'd have to let go of to buy into it. And what we find out is Shmuel's not ready to let go. So someone tell us about that story. What is it that Shmuel, when does that decision come for him of, this is what I'm going to do?
Yeah, if I'm not mistaken, I believe in that scene they're all sitting down for dinner, and they come and they give them a place at the table. Some of the apostles move and they give them a place at the table, and they're having conversation, right? They're having conversation, and he even says, I think, I'm open. Like, I want to know. And Jesus says, I see that you are. And so they have this open dialogue, and some of it seems to sit okay, some of it doesn't. I think they talk a little bit about, like, there's danger about. I think they talk a little bit about, like, Jesus is like, I didn't come for peace, this is what I came for. And some of his apostles are a little concerned, but then Mary comes in right in the middle of the conversation and interrupts everything. And she has purchased very, very expensive perfume or oil. Not quite sure what that was, and she starts washing his feet with it and her hair, and it absolutely is a deal breaker for them. Stan, how's that hit you?
Yeah, I think you described it very well. I mean, it seems like there's some good conversation going with maybe some traction for listening to what Jesus has to say, and then this interruption is against all tradition. I mean, you don't have that occur to begin with, and then when Mary lets down her hair, that's kind of the last straw. And Shmuel says something to Jesus, and then Jesus responds with, "Well, I'm sorry that we couldn't help you." And he said, "No, I'm sorry, I can't help you." And when he walks out, he's
Yes.
walking out in a huff, and he's kind of made up his mind that okay, that settles it. He is not who I thought he was. And then, ironically, Shemuel runs into Judas out
Mhm.
in the courtyard, and that's an interesting foreshadowing to Judas probably eventually making some sort of
Yeah.
deal with the religious leaders.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's maybe a good place for us to stop because our next episode will deal with Mary and Martha, and that'll bring us back to this dinner at Lazarus' house. But I do think we see kind of the different ways in which opposition comes. I mean, it could come from Roman authorities, but it could also come from these Jewish leaders. And we see different responses to Jesus, anger and, kind of a fist toward Jesus, kind of the what are we going to do with Jesus sort of discussion. And then those who are moving toward Jesus. That's kind of what life is for us, too. What are we going to do with Jesus? That's what we have to answer for ourselves. So may the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ and the love of God and the communion of the Holy Spirit be with us all. Amen.
Amen.